Hi, the sound you're hearing now was recorded in Superbooth 2018, and it's made by this module which I finally have my hands on. It's called SWN, or Spherical Wavetable Navigator, from 4MS. It's a 6-voice stereo wavetable synth. And what makes it special is that whereas with typical wavetable synths you can usually move in one direction through a wavetable, here you move in 3 dimensions, or in a sphere as they call it. To understand what spherical means, let's first look at how a regular wavetable synth works, and I'll use the companion software to SWN to explain, so we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone as we get to know it. If you're familiar with wavetable synths and with multi-dimensional wavetables, feel free to skip ahead to the panel layout section. As you may know, we typically hear sound because something is moving air back and forth, and those changes in air pressure are detected in our ears. So, for example, I'll load up a sine wave, and right now, if you don't mind, I'm moving the diaphragm inside the speaker, inside your phone headset or monitor, back and forth in the shape of a perfect sine wave. So if all goes well with the YouTubes, you should be hearing a single pitch sound based on the frequency of this movement. What's determining this back and forth motion in the diaphragm in your speaker is this sequence of, in this case, 512 voltage levels in this waveform, which happens to look like a sine wave. And if you look at the harmonics rectangle right below the waveform, you'll see that this sound has no harmonics. It just generates a tone at the fundamental frequency, which is whatever I set it to right here. Now, if I start messing with this waveform, it'll start to sound quite differently. Take a look at the harmonics as well. So I just created one waveform, and I have in SWN a table of 27 of these. So I could go ahead and load up another waveform, let's say a sawtooth, and then another. Let's make it a square, and then another, which is a mortlet 4, and let's just maybe try a few more of these. Now I could go ahead and play each and every one of these individually, or morph between them. So this is basically what wavetable synths allow. They allow you to store different waveforms in a table, which is 0 to 26 or 27 in this case, and they should typically also allow you to morph between those waveforms. Now, most wavetable synths settle for this one dimension of movement, which is morphing up and down the wavetable. Some wavetable synths organize their wavetable in a grid, somewhat like this. This lets you morph or move in 2 directions. Either left-right in this case, or up and down. In SWN, movement in this direction is called depth, and movement in this direction is called latitude. Now, SWN doesn't just settle for depth and latitude motion, they also let you move between 2 additional grids, 3x3 grids, and they call this movement longitude. Now, take a look at this dot. Notice it's full here, which means we're on this plane right now, but as we move the longitude, we move to this plane, and then to this plane. Now, if we populate this with one of the spheres that come with SWN, let's say this one. So let's take a listen to this motion. On the device itself are 12 different spheres. Let's take, for example, sphere number 1. Let's move around this a bit. Now you might look at this as a grid or a cube if you layer these one on top of the other. The reason that in SWN this is called a sphere is because as you move this dot across, as you modulate it, it'll wrap around itself. So notice as I move the depth, it goes back to position number 1 or 0, right? It loops back around. This looping motion happens in all 3 directions, depth, latitude, and longitude. So even the analogy of a sphere isn't exactly correct because this works in 3 dimensions plus 1. So a 2-dimensional grid, like a map, for example, if you continue traveling in any direction beyond the edge, you'll eventually loop back to the beginning, in the same way as if you traveled beyond Alaska on a map, you'll end up in Russia, at least according to the people who believe the world isn't flat. I never tried it. So 2 dimensions that wrap around themselves turn into a sphere. 3 dimensions that wrap onto themselves turn into a 4-dimensional object. I think it's just easier to treat this as a cube that you can travel in any 3-dimensional direction and eventually wrap around. Now, I won't go into this software in depth. There are quite a few effects that you can apply to waveforms here, like ring modulation or Chebyshev wave folding, which are pretty cool. I'll link to a tutorial to this software below. Once you've finished editing your wavetable, you can just play it into SWN. I'll show you how to record this waveform in a bit. Okay, so let's get back to the module. SWN has 6 voices. By default, each voice or wavetable oscillator loads up the same sphere of wavetables, but you can load up a different sphere into each one. It comes with 12 pre-populated spheres, and you can store an additional 108 spheres on the internal memory. As I mentioned before, each sphere is a 3x3x3 grid of 27 waveforms. You can mute and unmute the different oscillators. You can control their level as well. They're panned in the stereo field the minute you have 2 outputs connected. You can move all of them together around the sphere. And you can transpose them together, either octaves or semitones. Notice the indicator here, and you can also create chords with them. So if I push this knob in and turn it, there are over 20 of these. And you can transpose these as well. Most of the controls work in conjunction with the fine tune button, so if I wanted to, rather than transpose semitones, just do fine tuning, I would just hold this and turn the knob. This works across the oscillators, and if I press this in, for detuning as well. And I can always reset the preset by double tapping this. Each of the knobs or the encoders has a double function like you saw before. The label on top says what it does when you turn it regularly, and then the gold label on the bottom describes what happens when you push it in. So for example, I was browsing around the sphere using this knob, right? But if I press it in, I can change spheres. Now, as you may have noticed, up until now, I've been applying all the operations to all 6 channels or oscillators simultaneously. However, if I hold a channel button, I can change only its parameters. So let's say that I wanted to tune this channel a few semitones up. All right, I could do that. Tune this one. Or down. Okay. And reset. So for example, I could change the sphere just for this channel by holding this down and turning this knob and pressing it, right? So now I've got control of both spheres here, but this one is in a different sphere than this one. Now you can browse around the spheres in any of the individual dimensions. So let's say depth, right? Cycle between 3 waveforms this way. Latitude. Or longitude. Or just zigzag your way across the sphere using spherical browsing. If you notice the steps here, you can of course do this with fine-tune as well. Notice how the colors change based on where you are in the sphere. So I can sort of go back to the original location. This adds red to the color. This adds green. And this adds blue. And when they're in equal portions, it sort of becomes a whitish color. Now, up until now, we've been moving all 6 spots around the same location in the sphere. However, with Dispersion, which is a gold label, which means I need to press the depth button in and turn it, notice how now each quadrant here gets a different color. Not quadrant, each 6th, right? So each 6th of a circle represents the location of one of the channels, and now I can move them around the sphere, and they'll each grab a different location in the sphere. And there are a few dispersion patterns you can try out. It's quite easy to just lose yourself in the sphere. Aside from controlling pitch using the octave and semitone knobs, you can of course send in control voltage, and I'll get into what these buttons mean in a bit, I promise. You can also play SWN polyphonically. Okay, let's take a look at a few ways of controlling SWN's pitch with an external keyboard. The key step has pitch CV out. You can plug that into the transpose in, and then play all of the oscillators together. Right now they're set to play a chord, but I can just have them play one note. Now CV can send information for only one note per cable, but if you have a polyphonic MIDI to CV converter, you can play SWN polyphonically. I'll unplug the CV out. SWN will only accept CVs and will generate its own gate and envelope effectively. For this particular module, I need to plug in as many dummy cables into the gate inputs as I want polyphonic channels. And now all I need to do is hook up the pitch channels to the 6 CV inputs. And so much for color coding these. Let's try this first without VCA envelopes. Right now we're not applying modulation to any of the VCAs of any of the oscillators. Let's try the VCA envelopes, but with fewer channels. This is note mode where I'm triggering the LFOs as VCA envelopes. More on this later. In addition to the 6 wavetable oscillators, SWN also has 6 LFOs, and you can see them blinking in different phases here. Each LFO has its own output jack, and you can control its relative speed to the clock or to the tempo. You've got control over its amplitude or gain. You have control of its shape, 1 out of 25 shapes, and you can also control its phase relative to the others. There is a handy cheat sheet with the different LFO shapes and their respective colors as per the LEDs, and you can also just hook them up and listen to them either by hooking them up to the VCA, which I'll show you in a bit, or by hooking them up to pitch. So let's take a listen. For example, I'll take, let's say, this LFO and plug it into browsing the sphere. I can slow it down, make it faster, change its shape. Right now I'm changing the shape of all the LFOs. You can see all the colors change, but I could change just the shape of this individual LFO if I wanted. Man, I could change its gain as well. To have more extreme or less extreme movements. Right, and there are 6 of these LFOs. Now, like I said, by default, the LFOs aren't patched to anything, but you can activate internal patching from each of the LFOs or all of them to the VCA of each of their individual channels. So I'll reset this preset, and if I hit this button, you can see now, if I maybe change to a shape where you'll hear it a bit more, that each of these different channels get triggered. The reason they're getting triggered separately by, or the VCA is being modulated differently by each LFO, is because they're phase shifted. And if I spread them out to create a chord, right? It's quite easy to create an arpeggiated pattern just by applying different phases of the same LFO to the VCAs of the channels. And different LFOs can create different textures. I can reset all the LFOs, and if I do that, it'll just sound like a chord. Right, just by pressing those 2 buttons, and if I press them again, they'll go back to being phase shifted by 60 degrees each. Now, to create even more interesting textures, I can change the speed of each of the LFOs individually. Yeah, and it's quite easy to just get lost in LFO shapes or rates or chord shapes, locations in the sphere. So that's the LFO to VCA function. Like I said, you can change the LFO speed, gain, shape, and phase on a per channel basis. Actually, you can activate the LFO to VCA function on a per channel basis as well, so you don't have to apply it to all the channels at the same time. A bit more about the LFOs. They can go well into audio rates. So if I get them going again and then just turn up the speed. Right? They go into audio rates at some point. When they do, they'll go up in semitones. And there is some aliasing at the higher rates. But if you wanted to use them for playing notes, you could do that as well, or for audio rate modulation. Right, so those are the LFOs at audio rates. The LFOs also have 3 modes, which you can select with this button: the standard LFO, and then gate and trigger modes. So when they behave as a standard LFO, let's just maybe plug an LFO into the sphere again. Right, and slow it down. Right, so it'll just be an LFO shape. Maybe we'll pick, you gotta go by the colors, right? So this, for example, is no LFO. This is just flat, and I know that if I go back, these colors are triangle and sine wave LFOs. Right, so I can now move the LFO to gate mode, and you get a gate every time the LFO passes 50%. And in trigger mode, the same applies to triggers. And back to regular LFO mode, and if I go into gate mode and change the LFO shape, you can see that it behaves in a rhythmic fashion. Same for trigger mode, based on the LFO shape, whatever I choose, right? Okay, so those are the LFOs in LFO mode, but like I hinted before, they can also behave like envelopes. So by default, the LFOs in SWN are just constantly running. I'll just reset the patch. Right, they're always running. Now, if I press these 2 buttons, I toggle between 2 LFO envelope modes. This is note mode, and if I press them again, I'll go into keyboard mode. Notice the color changes, then press it again, back to LFO mode. So let's check out these modes. The first is note mode. Here, these buttons behave as gates, and if I open up the spread to a chord, then they'll just play whatever they're assigned. And the VCA envelope will be based on the shape of the LFO, right? So if I change the LFO shape to this, notice now it ramps up. And the shape begins once I release the note. So you can have an envelope in the shape of any of the LFOs, and if I plug control voltage into any one of these inputs, then each of the envelopes will trigger when there's a CV change. So in note mode, each of these buttons or control voltage change triggers a single cycle of the LFO as an envelope. Keyboard mode works a little bit differently. Here, these buttons just trigger quick attack decay envelopes. Now, when you're in note mode, then you've got a few quantizing options based on how you press and turn this scale knob. The lights will indicate what scale you're in. There are 4 options. Light blue is no quantization, dark blue semitones, pink major scale, and salmon is minor harmonic. As per everything here, I guess this works on a per channel basis. So I could change the scale for this channel, and this channel will behave differently, and so on. Same for the keyboard and note modes, right? So if I want, I could just have this behaving as an LFO, and then have note or keyboard mode applied to these guys, right? So this is droning on, and these are just in their various note modes. So those are note and keyboard modes. Now, aside from using the built-in 12 waveforms and creating waveforms on a computer using Sphere Edit, you can also sample your own waveforms directly into SWN. To get into sample mode, you press these 3 buttons together, and I'll connect audio to the waveform input. And if I hit the record button, it'll wait for audio to come in, and I can record up to 2.5 seconds of audio into this. So watch this circle. 1, 2, 3. Now this isn't necessarily intended for speech, but you can sort of hear the words as I cycle through the waveforms. Now you can also apply effects to each of the waveforms or to all 27. This is a wave folder, decimator, metallizer, a low pass filter. You've got level control or normalization, and then seam smoothness. Yeah, and you can keep scrolling through the 27 waveforms. If I like this waveform, by the way, I've got 108 slots to save it to. You can see these are sort of banks, and then all of these are empty slots. I've got something here, so I can just pick a spot. Let's say save it here, hold it for a few seconds. This turns red, and confirm to save. This saves, by the way, the entire state of the machine, so you can save quite a few setups that you like and then recall them very quickly. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. SWN is a powerful module, and as usual, with power comes complexity. There are quite a few button combos that are going to be hard to remember initially, so keep the cheat sheet handy and refer to it until everything starts to come together after a while. The easiest way, I think, to simplify SWN is to initially just ignore the LFOs and recording and focus on playing the sphere and traveling around it. Just loading up chords and looking around for sweet spots in a sphere is something I found quite enjoyable. Once you're familiar with that, you'll want to start modulating things, and that's where, of course, the LFOs will come in quite handy, and then you might want to venture out and create your own wavetables either by recording them directly or using the companion software and transferring them here. Overall, SWN is quite an impressive module. That's it for now. If you want to learn more about synthesis, check out my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Hit like if this was useful, and make sure to ring the bell after you subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.